What what happens to the self during mental illness? Like if we bring depression, generalized anxiety disorder, it's into that, how do those things impact the self? How do they warp the self? How do they morph it? How do they play tricks on it? Um, you have to assume that those illnesses are intimately tied to the self, if not originate from it. Like what do we know
Oh yeah.
generally about mental illness and the self?
So trying to think of where to start here, because this is a fascinating
Big topic. I
topic.
know a lot of these questions are like 10 hours of lectures. Just
No, I mean, because there is a lot of fascinating work that ties like components of the brain that we know to be involved in this kind of self-reflective process to some of these pathological traits, like especially depression, that linking to things like rumination, of constantly dwelling on these negative aspects of ourself and things like that. One of the things that I like to really kind of put into perspective, and the work that I did a lot kind of near the end of my graduate degree, was trying to think of how the self concept of self has this top-down influence on these other cognitive processes in our brain, the way that we make decisions, the way that we attend to the world, especially attention, right? That when we do this kind of reflective work of saying who I am, right? Like I mentioned earlier, like I'm a father or I'm a scientist or I'm this, I'm that. When we do that reflective work and we identify who we are, we're actually training our brain what to pay attention to, because there's
look.
two different types of attention, right? There's reflexive attention and there's effortful, like voluntary attention. And I think what the self is doing is it's shaping reflexive attention, right?
Right.
We're unaware of like 98% of what our brain's doing at any given time, right?
Yeah.
But thinking about like what actually gets to consciousness is fascinating. And I think that those gates, the things that are actually gating what gets to consciousness, what I'm looking at, what I'm paying attention to, are heavily driven by this top-down model of how we think about ourselves, right? Now, think about how powerful that concept is now, when instead of me having all of these thoughts about how I want to be a good father and I'm this or I'm that, now I'm constantly telling myself that I'm unworthy. I'm constantly telling myself that
Right.
I'm never going to amount to anything. I'm now teaching my brain to look for evidence of that in the world, and it'll find it, right?
Right.
So if I'm approaching the world from an optimistic standpoint and I'm saying like, you know what, today's going to be a great day, I'm now telling my brain to look for evidence that it's going to be a great day. But if I start the day saying like, you know, it's awful, it's always going to be awful, it always was, it always will be. Now I'm going to see all of those little things that I would have ignored from the optimistic perspective that are proving to myself that I am worthless, that I'm not going to amount to anything. And it becomes something that becomes kind of a cycle that you start to now dwell on it. You see that evidence, it now feeds back into the model of the way the way you think about yourself.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of
Prophecy. Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely.
My example of this is that I've always had the strongly held belief that I'm bad at language learning. I think is my biggest one. I ran a language company for 4 years. And everyone always slagged me that I only spoke one language. Still have a tenuous grasp on the English language. The first question always was, I was the CEO of a language learning company for 4 years, and everyone was like, "Oh, how many languages do you speak?" Like 7, and I have to be like barely one, like just about one. And so it's always been a foundational belief of mine that I'm bad at learning languages. And
Yeah.
since sort of learning about how, if you think you're bad at language learning, you're right, like in some sense, in not, but it's only right because you believe it. And I think what you say about attention is so true, where if I sit down on the couch and I say I'm a great language learner, I'm going to focus for 60 minutes and I'm going to apply the effort and attention that is matching of someone who is good at language learning. If I sit down with with the bad idea that I'm bad at language learning, I'm just going to sit there and I'm kind of be checking my phone and I'm going to be on Instagram, because that's what a bad language learner would do, right? They would be distracted. They wouldn't apply the effort and focus required to achieve their goal. And I went through this for so long, and it is, shamefully I can say that, but it still kind of is true to some extent. I can't just beat that. Like I still battling with that idea every day that I'm bad at language learning. But I know that it's because I'm not applying enough effort. I'm not applying enough attention because I have that self-limiting belief.
And I think that there's something about necessity, about the world, about like, were you ever put in a position where like you had to learn that other language and like it became such an ingrained part of who you were because of necessity, right? So much of our environment is driven by like what's possible around us. And we're constantly keeping track of how we're navigating those things. I taught this psychoactive drugs class this last term. And I've been kind of developing this idea around like dopamine and serotonin, and this kind of back and forth that I think might be going on. And again, some of this is speculative, but there is some interesting work that backs up some of this. A lot of what we know about dopamine now is that it's not reward, it's not pleasure. A lot of people think that like dopamine is pleasure, and like get that out of your head. It's not.
Yeah.
What most of the research is showing is that it's desire. It's motivation. And they even show like there's these ramps of dopamine where like as you're approaching the reward, as a rat is approaching the cheese at the end of the maze, the dopamine is getting higher and higher as it gets closer and closer. But as soon as it gets it, dopamine drops to zero, back to baseline, right? And so it's really about that drive to go out and get those things that you need in the world. And right. So it's this forward thinking thing. But the more I've looked at serotonin, really interesting when you get into like the effects of antidepressants and all of these things. There's a lot of ties in like the serotonin literature around serotonin marking things as being predictors of bad outcomes. So where you have like dopamine is responsible for tagging things as being kind of beneficial, right? Like I'm going to get that thing because it was good for me in the past.
Pursuit.
Serotonin, on the other hand, is more about kind of saying like, you have dopamine that's like, go get this thing. And serotonin is like, can I? Do I have evidence that I'm capable of doing that thing? And you go back, if you look all the way back to like early cells, like serotonin and dopamine are some of the earliest neurotransmitters that were present in like the earliest single celled organism.
And that's just a baffling fact. It's free. Oh.
And we gotta keep in mind that like serotonin is a very multifaceted neurotransmitter. It's involved in a lot of different stuff. But
I'm gonna give a
like we're thinking
headline just of serotonin, just so everyone has an idea, because I
totally
general audience. So just give a few of the the few of the most major points to do with serotonin and what its role is.
I mean, whenever you hear serotonin, a lot of it's talked about in terms of mood. And that's because of the fact that like we control antidepressant with serotonergic type drugs, right? And so it's like, okay, well, if this drug that is providing serotonin is changing your mood, then serotonin is heavily involved in mood. What I think a lot of people don't know is that like 95% of the serotonin is actually in your body, and it regulates like your gut, and it regulates like resource management. But then there's also a lot of these. I mean, I think that serotonin itself has like 17 different receptor types, receptor families, and antidepressants only hit one of those. They hit the HT1A receptor, whereas like psychedelics hit the HT2A receptor and make very different things happen in your brain than this other receptor. So serotonin is doing a lot of these different things. Right. But what I've tried to think about is like what was kind of the general mechanism of serotonin throughout evolutionary history. And you look at these first early cells, and what would happen is they were totally random in the way that they found food, right? They would find some resources and they would sit there on those resources until those resources were gone. But then when those resources are gone, they need to now explore the world in a random way to go find more resources, right? And what they found was that dopamine and serotonin were the signalers that were telling the cell to either stay here or to go out and search for new food.
Right.
So dopamine was like, go get something out there. And serotonin, what they think, was more about saying like, you know what? I have enough resources right here. I don't need to go out because I have what I need right
satiety,
here. And that's what really satiety, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you think about the gut, 95% of the serotonin in the gut. And so what I think is really going on is this like push and pull of we're constantly going through these forces in our brain and in these like drives and desires of like, I want to go out and do those things. But then there's this other system that's like, look at all those times that you failed. Right. Look at what you're capable of. You don't have the muscle mass, the ability to go do one of those things. Like, and it's built in these beliefs that we have. And it's this tug. It's like, should I go expend energy to go out and accomplish something? Because that's what dopamine is telling me to do. Right. I need to waste some of my resources to maybe get something. But if I was born into a traumatic environment and I was constantly engaged in these things that never came to like fruitful conclusions, where like I never had an opportunity to do something fun, to do something rewarding, to do something pleasurable. I was told by kind of caregivers that I was like never going to amount to anything. I start to internalize those beliefs, and I start to then dwell on those whenever I have these urges that are like, go out and be that thing that you want to be. Go out and do that thing that you want to do. I now have this other system in me that's like, but wait, like, no, I have a lot of evidence built up that shows that I can't do that.
Right.
Right. And it's it's kind of fighting that tug and pull that I think is evident in a lot of mental illness, is really trying to find, like, how do I build up the desire component? How do I build it up strong enough that I feel capable enough to actually go and do those things that I want to do, to find that intrinsic motivation? And so a lot of it, like you said, building the evidence that you can is a big part of that. And a lot of it too is redefining these misconceptions you might have about yourself and what you're capable of.
Right. It's well tied together. So do you think, like, people, it's often, I guess, I think a simple idea that people might have is that serotonin is good. Now that's very, it's lack all nuance completely, but more serotonin better is like generally, something that people might identify with. Does having too much serotonin reduce the amount of effort that you will apply to the world? Like if you are, I think that I've always, my mom, I think I get this from my mom because she just oozes serotonin. I mean that, like, she works hard, but she'll, there could be an earthquake outside and she'd be like, the weather's lovely, isn't it? That was always her. Very half glass empty. Like,
Yeah.
just like, the world could be exploding and she would find all the positive elements from it. And I know it's a very simplified frame to say that's due to serotonin, but is it the case that people who have too much serotonin aren't motivated? Is it that simple?
So I really try to steer away from like high and low serotonin when I'm thinking about serotonin in general, just because of how complex the entire system is, all of the different subtypes that we're talking about.
Right.
And that's where, like, the framing that I was trying to go with was like, what is this system trying to do, like, as a whole? And that system as a whole, like, it could be a pattern of low serotonin in this part of the brain with high serotonin in this part of the brain.
Right.
But ultimately what that system is trying to accomplish is trying to accomplish satiety, trying to accomplish like capability, right? Trying to kind of create a measure of what I'm capable of doing. Whereas, because you see that, like, high serotonin in midbrain, that's what antidepressants are, right? So HT1A receptors are really heavily concentrated in limbic areas of the brain. The limbic area of the brain is kind of the emotional centers of the brain. And what we see when we kind of like saturate those parts of the brain is that it actually numbs those emotional feelings. And that's where a lot of like antidepressants are numbing. They numb a lot of those bad feelings, but they also numb a lot of those positive feelings. Whereas now you do a huge increase in serotonin in the cortex with HT2A receptors, and now you have a very different experience, right? This is what psychedelics do, is that they open up these cortical receptors, which I think are a lot more about kind of opening up cognitive flexibility and like seeing things in a different way. This is why they think like they might be good for like depression and things like this, because it's like opening up this new way of seeing the world and allowing the senses to integrate in different ways than they have before. So it's a very kind of nuanced and complicated thing that's not just about high or low, but where you're kind of targeting in the brain.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed that short clip with Dr. Taylor Guthrie. We are trying everything we can to make the absolute best neuroscience content for you. So if you're appreciating it, then please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Go check out the main channel and the full episode with Dr. Taylor Guthrie now. We cover so many different aspects of social neuroscience. It really is a masterclass, and I really think you will enjoy it and learn a lot. Thank you so much, everyone.